In this lesson, we are going to learn how to use the prefixes in naming molecular compounds. When we look at molecular compounds, we know that they're made of two or more nonmetals. We can further subdivide this into organic and inorganic compounds. Organic compounds are composed primarily of carbon and hydrogen, and inorganic compounds are those that are not primarily carbon and hydrogen. So they still contain nonmetals, but they're not primarily composed of carbon and hydrogen. And we're going to focus first on these inorganic compounds. When we talk about naming molecular compounds, what we're referring to is our inorganic compounds. So for these inorganic compounds, we have a set of prefixes, and each of those prefixes tells us about the number of atoms. For example, if we have one atom of a certain type of element, we would use the prefix mono. If we have two atoms, we'd use the prefix di. We're going to learn all the way up to 10. There are additional ones beyond that, but we're not going to go any farther than 10. So you are expected to know this list of prefixes. Some of them are easier to remember than others. For example, 8 has the prefix octa, sounds like octagon, which has 8 sides. It's important for you to know the prefixes so that you can interpret formulas and names. However, you will not have to name compounds from scratch. We'll go through some examples so you can see how you are expected to use these prefixes. Let's look at an example. What is the formula for dinitrogen trioxide? What we want to look at is the identity of the elements found in this compound name. We see the word nitrogen, and we see oxide, which sounds like oxygen. The next thing we look for are the prefixes. So before nitrogen, we see di. Before oxygen, we see tri. We can use this information to figure out the formula. We know we have 2 nitrogens and 3 oxygens, so our formula is N2O3. So you should be able to interpret the name to determine the formula of a compound. Let's look at another example. What is the formula for sulfur hexafluoride? Well, we see we have sulfur, so we can write down the symbol for sulfur, but we notice there's no prefix before sulfur. And when that happens, we know that the value is 1. So sulfur itself has no prefix, so it's not going to have a subscript in the formula. Next, we see we have fluoride, which represents fluorine, and we aren't going to talk about why the name changes a little bit when we form a compound name as opposed to the element name, but we can write the symbol F, and the hexa tells us that we have a subscript of 6. Remember, no prefix means that it's equal to 1. We will only see that on the first element. The second element will always have a prefix, and we'll use the prefix mono if there is only one of them. Something else you should be able to do is to fill in the missing prefixes. So what prefixes are needed for I2O5? The basic structure of the name is given. We have the iodine and the oxide, and we have blanks for the prefixes. So you should be able to fill those in to complete the name of the compound. We look at the formula and we see that iodine has a subscript of 2, so we are going to use the prefix di. When we look at oxygen in the formula, we see that it has a subscript of 5, so we're going to use the prefix penta for oxygen. So the name of this compound is diiodine pentaoxide. In some names you'll see that a letter has been dropped. For example, instead of saying pentaoxide, it's often changed to pentoxide to remove the double vowel. Either one would be considered correct when entering the prefix on an exam. Let's look at another example. Disulfur decafluoride. How many sulfur atoms are in this compound? Sulfur has the prefix di, so we have 2 sulfur atoms. How many fluorine atoms are in this compound? The prefix for fluoride is deca, which means 10, so there are 10 fluorine atoms in this compound. And that would make the formula S2F10. Let's look at the formula N2O. What prefix is needed for nitrogen? There are 2 nitrogen atoms, so we need the prefix di. What prefix is needed for oxide? There's only one oxygen in the formula, so we're going to use the prefix mono, and we're going to drop one of the O's so we don't have two O's together, so we get the name of the compound is dinitrogen monoxide.